What you mean, where? You don't see the 613 middle part bust down 40 inch down? I didn't told y'all girls, I be the bitch that do it.
Hey everyone, welcome to Friday. Thanks for joining us for 9 News at Noon. I'm Matt Venezio. We'll start here. We're learning new details about a shooting yesterday on Columbus Dunn Drive. 18-year-old Kassidy Jackson has died from her injuries after being rushed to the hospital yesterday. We're told that Jackson was shot yesterday around 2 o'clock. Authorities say Paulasia Banks was identified as a potential shooter and later turned herself into law enforcement officers. Now, she was booked into the East Baton Rouge Parish Prison on a first-degree murder charge.
On January 8th, 2026, at approximately 2 p.m., the Baton Rouge Police Department received a report of gunfire at a residence on the 1700 block of Columbus Dunn Drive in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Upon arrival, officers discovered 18-year-old Kassidy Jackson with a gunshot wound inside the home. Emergency medical services transported Jackson to a nearby hospital, where she was later pronounced deceased. Preliminary investigations indicated that 19-year-old Paulasia Banks had traveled to the residence earlier that day with two other individuals. Authorities classified the incident as domestic-related, noting that multiple witness accounts and physical evidence will require detailed analysis to determine the sequence of events. Investigators focused on entry points, movements within the home, and the presence of firearm not registered to occupants. Banks was subsequently taken into custody, and law enforcement began compiling evidence, statements, and forensic reports to establish intent, actions, and responsibility in what rapidly became a high-profile criminal investigation. Stay with us as we unravel this shocking story and uncover the heartbreaking details of what led to this senseless loss. Before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are your thoughts as the story unfolds? Welcome to True Crime Tales, where we reveal the crimes that shock communities and the secrets hidden behind closed doors. These are real people, real events, real consequences. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's begin. Kassidy Jackson was 18 years old at the time of her death. She resided on Columbus Dunn Drive in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where the shooting later occurred. At the time, she was living in a residential neighborhood that included multi-occupant homes and frequent foot and vehicle traffic. Jackson was considered a legal adult and was in a transitional phase of life, navigating education, relationships, and future planning. Jackson had recently completed her secondary education, or was nearing completion, based on her age. Available information suggests she maintained a consistent daily routine that included spending time at home, engaging with friends, and communicating regularly through social media platforms. There is no public record confirming full-time employment at the time of her death, though individuals close to her indicated she had discussed plans related to work or continued education. Like many individuals her age, her daily activities were centered around peer interaction, home life, and digital communication. Jackson's residence on Columbus Dunn Drive was not a temporary location. She was familiar with the household layout and those who frequented the home. The residence served as both a private living space and a social environment where friends and romantic partners would occasionally visit. Jackson had immediate family members who were actively present in her life. While full details of her family structure were not widely released, it was confirmed that she maintained contact with relatives and had an established support system. At the time of the incident, Jackson was living in a shared household environment rather than living alone. Her living arrangements placed her in close daily contact with others, which later became relevant during the investigation, as multiple individuals were present inside the residence before the shooting. Family members later became involved in post-incident proceedings, including funeral arrangements and cooperation with law enforcement. There were no public records indicating long-term domestic instability or ongoing family disputes involving Jackson. Her home life appeared structured, with routine occupancy and consistent patterns of residence. Jackson maintained a regular social life and was actively connected to peer groups within her age range. She had friendships that extended both in person and online. These relationships were primarily maintained through direct contact and social media interaction. Romantic relationships played a significant role in the events leading up to the incident. At the time of her death, Jackson was involved in a romantic relationship separate from a previous relationship with Paulasia Banks. The nature of these overlapping relationships became a focal point during the investigation. Jackson's prior relationship with Banks had ended before the shooting. However, communication between the two did not completely cease immediately following the separation. The transition from former partners to non-contact appears to have contributed to interpersonal tension. There were no confirmed reports of physical altercations involving Jackson prior to the incident. However, verbal disagreements and disputes related to relationship boundaries were later referenced in investigative findings. Jackson was active on several social media platforms, which she used to communicate with friends, romantic partners, and acquaintances. Her digital presence included direct messaging, posting, and engagement with content created by others. In the days leading up to the shooting, Jackson limited or restricted communication with Banks through social media. Investigators later confirmed that Banks had been blocked on at least one platform. This action effectively ended direct digital communication between the two. The decision to block Banks was interpreted by investigators as a point of escalation in the deteriorating relationship. While no threats were publicly documented in the immediate period prior to the shooting, the lack of communication was noted as a contributing factor to rising tension. Paulasia Banks was 19 years old at the time of the incident. She resided in the Baton Rouge area and was familiar with Jackson's residence and daily routine. Banks' personal background included peer-level education and social integration typical for her age group. Banks had no publicly documented long-term employment at the time of the incident. Her educational status was not fully disclosed, though she had completed or nearly completed secondary education. She was socially active and maintained communication primarily through direct interaction and digital platforms. Banks had prior familiarity with the Columbus Dunn Drive residence and had visited the location before the date of the shooting. Banks and Jackson had previously been in a romantic relationship. The relationship ended before the incident, though the exact date of separation was not publicly specified. Following the breakup, communication between the two became inconsistent and strained. Investigators later determined that Banks was aware Jackson had entered a new romantic relationship. This development coincided with a reduction in communication and eventual blocking on social media platforms. The timeline suggests that unresolved conflict remained after the relationship ended. Banks' attempts to reestablish contact were unsuccessful in the days leading up to the incident. There were no publicly documented criminal convictions involving Banks prior to this case. However, investigators noted a pattern of persistent contact attempts following the end of the relationship. Banks' behavior in the period before the shooting included seeking direct, in-person contact after digital communication was cut off. This shift from online interaction to physical presence became a significant element in the case narrative. No verified records confirmed prior physical violence involving Banks. However, law enforcement later cited escalating behavior and poor conflict resolution as relevant factors. Banks did not legally own the firearm used in the shooting. Investigators determined the weapon was borrowed prior to the incident. The exact source of the firearm was identified during the investigation, but was not publicly detailed in initial reports. Banks demonstrated basic familiarity with the weapon, sufficient to discharge it. There was no evidence indicating professional training or licensed ownership. The decision to carry a firearm to Jackson's residence became a central issue in determining intent and premeditation. In the days before the shooting, communication between Banks and Jackson declined significantly. Jackson's decision to block Banks on social media effectively ended direct messaging. There were no documented in-person confrontations during this period. However, investigators later concluded that Banks was aware of Jackson's whereabouts and living situation. On the day of the shooting, Banks moved about Baton Rouge before deciding to go to Jackson's residence. She was accompanied by two unidentified male individuals, whose involvement later became part of the investigation. The decision to travel to Columbus Dunn Drive occurred after failed attempts to communicate digitally. The presence of additional individuals suggested foreknowledge of potential confrontation. Banks arrived at the residence during the early afternoon hours. The method of entry became a contested issue during the investigation. Witness statements differed on whether entry was forced or initially permitted. What is confirmed is that Banks entered the residence, encountered occupants inside, and a confrontation followed. The events inside the home escalated rapidly, leading to the discharge of firearms shortly thereafter. On the afternoon of January 8, 2026, events unfolded inside a residence on Columbus Dunn Drive in Baton Rouge that would later become the central focus of a homicide investigation. At the time, Kassidy Jackson was inside the home along with her current girlfriend. The residence was occupied and active, with no initial indication that a violent incident was imminent. Paulasia Banks arrived at the location, accompanied by two unidentified men. Investigators later focused on the circumstances of their arrival, including how they gained access to the residence and whether their presence was expected. According to witness accounts, Banks entered the home and encountered individuals already inside. The interaction quickly shifted from an initial exchange to a confrontation. Jackson's current girlfriend was present during this encounter and became directly involved in the interaction. Statements indicate that words were exchanged between Banks and the occupants of the home. The verbal exchange escalated rapidly, with raised voices and confrontational language. Investigators noted that the exchange appeared to center on personal and relational issues involving Jackson. Witnesses inside the home described Banks as engaging directly with Jackson's current girlfriend. The confrontation intensified as Banks moved further into the residence. The discussion did not remain contained to one area of the home and instead shifted toward the entryway as tensions increased. The situation progressed beyond verbal communication, setting the stage for physical involvement. The presence of the two unidentified men was noted, though their level of participation during this stage remained unclear. Investigators later sought to determine whether they attempted to intervene, observed passively, or exited the residence before the shooting occurred. As the verbal confrontation escalated, a physical struggle began near the doorway of the residence. Witnesses reported physical movements consistent with pushing and defensive actions. During this struggle, Banks was forced toward the exit of the home. Statements indicate that Banks was pushed out of the residence, and the door separating the interior of the home from the exterior was closed. The physical layout of the entryway became a significant factor in the investigation. The door, surrounding walls, and relative positioning of individuals inside the home were carefully documented by law enforcement. At the time Banks was pushed outside, Kassidy Jackson remained inside the residence, positioned away from the doorway, but within the line of sight from inside the home. Shortly after Banks was pushed out of the residence, a firearm was discharged from outside the home through the closed door. The weapon was fired in the direction of the interior space where occupants were located. The bullet traveled through the door and into the residence. Ballistic analysis later focused on the trajectory of the bullet, including the height of entry through the door and its path inside the home. Kassidy Jackson was struck by the projectile while inside the residence. The location of the gunshot wound and the bullet's trajectory became critical components of the investigation. Immediately following the discharge of the weapon, individuals inside the home reacted by moving toward Jackson and assessing her condition. No additional shots were reported. The two unidentified men were no longer inside the residence at this point, though their exact movements during the shooting remained part of the investigative review. After firing the weapon, Banks left the scene. Witness statements indicate that she did not remain at the residence following the shooting. The firearm used in the incident was not left behind and was not immediately recovered at the scene. Inside the home, occupants assessed Kassidy Jackson's condition. There were no indications that Banks attempted to render aid before leaving. The focus inside the residence shifted to responding to the gunshot injury, while emergency services were contacted. Jackson remained inside the home awaiting medical assistance. Her condition was described as critical. Those present provided information to emergency dispatchers while attempting to manage the situation until help arrived. Law enforcement officers were dispatched to the residence following reports of a shooting. Officers arrived and secured the scene, ensuring there were no immediate threats present. The residence was treated as an active crime scene. Initial observation by officers included visible damage to the front door consistent with a gunshot, as well as blood evidence inside the home. Officers confirmed that the suspect was no longer on the scene and began preliminary interviews with witnesses present. Emergency medical services arrived shortly after law enforcement. Paramedics provided emergency medical care to Kassidy Jackson at the scene before transporting her to a local hospital. Life-saving measures were attempted during transport. Despite medical intervention, Jackson was later pronounced deceased at the hospital. The time of death was recorded, and investigators were notified to proceed with the next phase of the investigation. Crime scene investigators processed the residence after emergency personnel cleared the area. Evidence collected included bullet fragments, damage to the door, and other physical indicators related to the shooting. The location of the gunshot entry point and the bullet's trajectory were documented. Shell casings were not recovered inside the residence, consistent with the weapon being fired from outside. The firearm itself was not recovered at the scene, prompting further investigative efforts to locate it. Detectives conducted interviews with all individuals present inside the home at the time of the shooting. Statements were taken from Jackson's current girlfriend and others who witnessed the confrontation. Each account was analyzed for consistency regarding the sequence of events. Neighbors were also interviewed to determine whether they observed or heard anything relevant, including the arrival and departure of vehicles or individuals. Their observations were used to establish a timeline. The two unidentified men who accompanied Banks were identified as persons of interest and questioned regarding their involvement and movement before and after the shooting. After leaving the residence, Banks departed the area using a vehicle associated with her. Investigators tracked her movements following the incident to establish her actions after the shooting. Banks later turned herself into authorities, accompanied by legal representation. Her decision to surrender became a significant development in the case, allowing investigators to formally question her regarding the incident. As the investigation progressed, detectives identified inconsistencies between witness statements and Banks' account of events. Particular attention was paid to claims that the shooting was accidental. Physical evidence, including ballistic findings and positioning of the door, contradicted assertions that the weapon discharged unintentionally. The act of firing through a closed door was evaluated in relation to intent and recklessness. Based on the totality of evidence, investigators established probable cause that the shooting constituted a criminal act. These findings led to formal charges and the continuation of legal proceedings. Following the fatal shooting of 18-year-old Kassidy Jackson inside a residence on Columbus Dunn Drive in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, law enforcement moved quickly to identify and locate a suspect. Investigators named 19-year-old Paulasia Banks as the primary person of interest based on witness statements, physical evidence at the scene, and information obtained during early interviews. Within hours of the shooting, Banks was no longer at the residence, and authorities began coordinating her surrender. Later the same day, Paulasia Banks surrendered herself to law enforcement, accompanied by legal representation. Her decision deterred herself and was coordinated through her attorney, signaling an immediate transition from investigation to formal criminal proceedings. Upon arrival at the designated law enforcement facility, Banks was taken into custody without incident. Banks was transported to the East Baton Rouge Parish Jail, where standard booking procedures were conducted. These procedures included fingerprinting, photographing for a mugshot, and a collection of personal identification information. Officers documented her physical condition and recorded the clothing she was wearing at the time of booking. No injuries were reported during intake. During processing, Banks was informed of the charges being brought against her and advised of her legal rights. She remained in custody pending her initial court appearance. The booking process marked the first official step in the judicial handling of the case, transitioning the matter from a homicide investigation to an active prosecution. Prosecutors formally charged Paulasia Banks with first-degree murder, a charge that under Louisiana law requires proof of specific intent to kill or inflict great bodily harm. The charge reflected the prosecution's early assessment that the shooting was not accidental and that the actions leading up to the discharge of the firearm met the statutory threshold for intentional homicide. In addition to the murder charge, prosecutors filed additional charges related to unlawful entry and firearm use. These included allegations that Banks entered or attempted to enter the residence without permission and that the firearm was used during the commission of a violent felony. The inclusion of these charges indicated that authorities viewed the events as a sequence of escalating actions rather than an isolated moment. Each charge carried significant potential penalties, including lengthy prison sentences if convicted. Prosecutors emphasized that the severity of the charges reflected both the outcome of the incident and the circumstances surrounding it. Law enforcement officials characterized the case as a domestic-related incident that escalated into lethal violence. In public statements, police confirmed that multiple individuals were present during the confrontation and that physical evidence supported conclusion that the firearm was discharged from outside the room where Kassidy Jackson was located. Authorities stated that the investigation included interviews with witnesses, examination of the scene, and analysis of ballistic evidence. Police rejected early suggestions that the shooting occurred accidentally, noting that the location of the shooter and the victim at the time of the gunfire raised serious concerns. The defense attorney representing Paulasia Banks offered a different interpretation. According to defense statements, the shooting was a result of a chaotic confrontation that escalated unexpectedly. The defense maintained that Banks did not intend to kill Kassidy Jackson, and that the discharge of the firearm occurred during a moment of confusion and stress. Prosecutors responded by asserting that intent could be inferred from actions, including bringing a firearm to residence and firing it through a closed door. They emphasized that the legal definition of intent does not require a prolonged plan, but can be established through deliberate actions taken in the moment. As the case moved forward, two sharply different narratives emerged, one presented by the defense and the other by the prosecution. The defense argued that the shooting was accidental and occurred during a volatile confrontation. According to this account, Banks went to the residence to confront Kassidy Jackson regarding relationship issues. A physical altercation allegedly ensued, resulting in Banks being pushed out of the residence. The defense claimed that the firearm discharged unintentionally during this moment, emphasizing that there was no expressed desire to harm Jackson. They described the encounter as chaotic, with multiple people present and heightened tension influencing split-second decisions. Central to the defense strategy was the assertion that the absence of premeditation undermined the first-degree murder charge. By framing the shooting as unintentional, the defense aimed to challenge the prosecution's burden of proving specific intent. Prosecutors countered by focusing on the sequence of actions taken by Banks before and during the shooting. They argued that intent could be inferred from the decision to bring a firearm to residence, the act of attempting entry, and the firing of the weapon through a closed door. According to prosecution, being pushed out of the residence did not justify the use of deadly force. They emphasized that firing blindly through a door demonstrated a conscious disregard for human life and met the legal standard for intent under state law. The prosecution also highlighted evidence suggesting forced entry and escalation, arguing that Banks' actions showed a progression toward violence rather than an isolated accident. Key disputes centered on ballistic evidence, including the trajectory of the bullet and the point of impact. Investigators examined door damage, bullet fragments, and the position of the victim to reconstruct the shooting. Prosecutors asserted that the bullet's path supported their version of events. Witness credibility also became a central issue. Individuals present in the residence provided accounts that varied in detail, leading to questions about consistency and reliability. The defense argued that these inconsistencies weakened the prosecution's case, while prosecutors maintained that physical evidence corroborated the core facts. Banks' initial court appearance focused on formalizing the charges and addressing bond. Prosecutors argued against bond or requested a high bond amount, citing the severity of the charges and the risk to public safety. The defense requested consideration of bond based on Banks' voluntary surrender and lack of prior convictions. Pre-trial motions followed, including requests for discovery, motions to suppress certain evidence, and arguments regarding the admissibility of witness statements. Both sides began reviewing forensic reports, including ballistic analysis and autopsy findings. The autopsy established the cause of death and provided details regarding the fatal wound. Digital evidence, including text messages and social media interactions, was examined to establish context and potential motive. Prosecutors viewed digital communications as evidence of escalating conflict, while the defense argued that online interactions did not equate to intent to kill. As the case progressed, the possibility of plea negotiations remained open. Prosecutors considered whether lesser charges could be pursued in exchange for a guilty plea, while the defense evaluated the risks of trial versus negotiated sentencing. If the case proceeded to trial, prosecutors planned to rely on physical evidence, expert testimony, and witness accounts. The defense strategy focused on challenging intent, emphasizing uncertainty and highlighting inconsistencies. Possible sentencing outcomes range from decades in prison to life imprisonment, depending on the charges ultimately upheld and the verdict reached. The death of Kassidy Jackson extended beyond the crime scene on Columbus Dunn Drive and continued to affect multiple layers of individuals and institutions. Following the shooting, attention shifted from the immediate investigation to the consequences left behind, including the impact on the victim's family, the response from the surrounding community, and broader systemic concerns tied to youth violence, firearms, and interpersonal conflict among young adults. After Kassidy Jackson was pronounced deceased at the hospital, responsibility for funeral arrangements fell to her immediate family. Plans were made privately, with limited public disclosure regarding dates and services. The funeral process involved coordination with local funeral homes, logistical planning, and financial considerations common in cases involving sudden death. There was no indication that services were open to the general public, suggesting a controlled and private setting chosen by the family. The timing of the arrangements followed standard procedures after an autopsy and official release of the body. No disputes over custody or arrangements were publicly reported, and no legal delays interfered with the burial process. The family of Kassidy Jackson did not immediately issue formal public statements following her death. This absence of public commentary left many questions unanswered and limited the amount of personal information available about the victim's life. The lack of statements may have been intentional, reflecting a preference for privacy during an active criminal investigation. Law enforcement agencies did not report cooperation issues with family members, indicating that communication with investigators likely occurred outside the public view. Any statements that were shared occurred through legal channels rather than media interviews. The long-term effects on Jackson's family include legal involvement, ongoing court proceedings, and the responsibility of participating in the judicial process as the case moves forward. Family members may be required to attend hearings, provide victim impact statements at sentencing if applicable, and remain engaged with prosecutors throughout the duration of the case. Additionally, the family must manage the permanent absence of a household member while navigating public attention surrounding a homicide case. These effects extend over months or years, depending on how long the legal process continues. News of the shooting spread quickly throughout Baton Rouge, particularly within neighborhoods already familiar with violent incidents involving young individuals. The case received attention due to the ages of both the victim and the suspect, highlighting a recurring pattern of youth-related violence in the area. Public reaction largely occurred through social media discussions, online forums, and local commentary rather than organized demonstrations. Residents expressed concern over safety, while others focused on the legal process and potential outcomes of the charges filed. The case contributed to renewed discussions about violence involving teenagers and young adults. Local conversations reference a pattern of disputes escalating into lethal outcomes, often involving individuals under the age of 21. The involvement of personal relationships in violent incidents was frequently noted. Community leaders and residents discuss a role of conflict resolution, parental oversight, and the lack of effective intervention before disputes become violent. The case became part of a broader narrative concerning youth exposure to violence and the consequences of unresolved interpersonal conflict. Calls for accountability emerged primarily in relation to the suspect and the legal system. There were expectations that prosecutors would pursue charges consistent with the evidence collected and that the court would fully examine the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Some discussions extended to broader accountability, including how firearms are accessed by young individuals and whether warning signs were present prior to the incident. However, no formal community action initiatives were publicly announced in response to this case alone. One of the central issues raised by the case is how a young adult obtained access to a firearm. Investigators confirmed that the weapon used was not registered to the suspect, raising questions about informal firearm transfers, unsecured weapons, and accountability for gun ownership. The case reflects a broader issue in which firearms are accessible to individuals without legal ownership, often through acquaintances or family members. This access increases the likelihood that disputes escalate into deadly encounters, particularly among individuals with limited conflict management skills. The shooting was classified as domestic-related, emphasizing the risks associated with unresolved relationship conflicts. Domestic disputes among young adults frequently involve heightened emotions, limited life experience, and poor decision-making under stress. This case demonstrated how interpersonal disputes can quickly escalate when combined with physical confrontation and weapon access. It also highlighted challenges in identifying when a relationship dispute has reached a dangerous threshold requiring intervention. Investigators examined digital communication as part of the case, including blocked contact and online interactions. Social media platforms often serve as both communication tools and sources of conflict, allowing disputes to continue beyond physical proximity. In this case, digital interactions reportedly contributed to tension and may have influenced decisions made on the day of the shooting. The rapid nature of online communication can intensify misunderstandings and provoke confrontational behavior without immediate mediation. Despite arrests and charges, several critical questions remain unanswered and are expected to be addressed during court proceedings. Conflicting accounts exist regarding the sequence of events inside the residence. While investigators documented evidence suggesting forced entry and intentional discharge, defense claims describe a chaotic confrontation. The precise movements of individuals and the exact moment the firearm was fired remain key issues. The presence of two unidentified men at the scene raises questions about their role before, during, and after the shooting. Their actions, statements, and potential involvement have not been fully disclosed publicly. Determining intent remains central to the case. Prosecutors argue that actions taken before and during the incident demonstrate intent, while the defense maintains the shooting was unplanned. This determination will significantly influence legal outcomes. The case raises questions about whether earlier intervention by family members, peers, or authorities could have prevented the fatal encounter. These considerations extend beyond individual responsibility to systemic awareness. Finally, the case prompts examination of broader systems, including firearm regulation, social support networks, and conflict intervention resources. Whether these systems failed, were bypassed, or were never engaged remains a subject of ongoing evaluation. If you found this story as gripping and heartbreaking as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. And if you want to hear more true crime stories that uncover the mysteries behind these tragic events, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell. You won't want to miss our latest stories, updates, and discussions. Thank you for joining us on this journey to seek justice and explore the truth. Together, we can make a difference. Until next time, stay safe and stay aware.